My gang, of all the chapters of Warhammer 40k, there were few as absolutely horrible as the Firehawks. Loved by the Adeptus on Terra, hated by their allies in the field, the Firehawks' dire reputation would eventually catch up with them when they were lost in the warp and turned into the Imperium's spookiest ghost story. The Firehawks are arseholes. Like, really, even for Space Marines, they're pretty horrible, and this is a series about the Badab War. A callous, brutal and unflinching chapter. They were, for many years, the darlings of the High Lords for their willingness to finish a war whatever the cost in human life, and whatever the cost to their allies. Exceptional close assault warriors, their own martial pride not only found them frequently under strength, but was one of the main instigating factors that caused the conflict in Badab. But their story is marked by loss, a traumatic origin in the fires of religious unrest, the loss of two different homeworlds, and then the loss of their bodies and eventually their sanity as, adrift in the warp, they turned into something else entirely. The Firehawks chapter was founded in early M36, a part of the 21st founding. This founding, of course, later became known as the Cursed Founding because of the tragic fate of many of the chapters that were created from it. The uncontrolled mutations of the Black Dragons, the tragic bad luck of the Lamenters, and the fate of the Firehawks themselves all speak to some issue at the heart of the founding, though the exact reason for such ill-fated results has never been found. According to the records of the Firehawks, their gene seed was derived from the popular Ultramarines lineage, though certain markers in their tithed gene seed submissions suggest otherwise. Their earliest recorded activity was to define a lot of their character. Soon after their founding, the Imperium was forced to suffer through the Age of Apostasy, when the paranoid High Lord Gouge Vandire took over the positions of both Lord of the Administratum and Ecclesiarch, ushering in a reign of blood that lasted 7 decades. Planets burned under the guns of both the Imperial Guard and the Frateris Templar on the whim of Vandire. Wars of faith were launched against loyal worlds for some perceived slight only known to the paranoid High Lord. During this time, most Space Marine chapters stayed out of the conflict, seeing the governance of the Imperium as something out of their concern. But the Firehawks were one of the few who chose to involve themselves. Ever a faithful chapter, one of the rare Space Marine chapters that cleaved to the Imperial cult and venerated the Emperor as a god, the Firehawks, alongside the Imperial Fists, Black Templars and Soul Drinkers, stood against the callous excesses of Vandire and fought the fanatics of the Ministorum at every turn. And they even took part in the final attack on Terra that saw the overthrow of Vandire and the installation of Sebastian Thor as the new Ecclesiarch. The young chapter paid dearly for this. Their original homeworld, Zoros, was firebombed by the Frateris Templar, reducing it to cinders, and the chapter became fleet-based, though in recognition of their service, Sebastian Thor gave them the colossal pre-Crusade Star Fortress Rapturus Rex to serve as their flagship. These early wars heavily influenced the chapter's methods and beliefs. A fanatically religious chapter, the Firehawks were staunch traditionalists and believers in the status quo of the Imperium, ever ready to turn their guns on traitorous commanders or apostate cardinals. And the brutal nature of their birth made them notably callous in battle. The Firehawks carried a dark reputation for excessive use of force against civilian populations, or for simply abandoning their allies to their deaths when they felt that a more tactically preferable outcome could be reached a different way. The Firehawks cared little about the death toll involved as long as they achieved victory, and their record in that was exemplary, which made them a popular chapter amongst the High Lords of Terra, but not so much amongst the Space Marine chapters they fought alongside. The Firehawks broadly, but only broadly, conformed to the structure of the Codex Astartes. Their company structure and squad loadout were Codex compliant, but their markings and ranks diverged considerably, with many of those changes deriving from the beliefs of the tribes on their original homeworld, Zoros, beliefs that were carefully husbanded and kept alive even after the destruction of that world by the Firehawks chaplains. The Firehawks were clad in flame-red power armor, and their symbol was the hawk rising from the flames, but individual ornamentation varied considerably. Fire patterns in flame yellow were common decoration, along with death's heads and symbols of fear and terror, and with officers' armor decorated with personal heraldries. Feudal heraldic ranks were also common, added to their codex ranks, so many Battle Brothers held complex titles such as Armiger Brother, Preceptor Sergeant, or Knight Captain. These martial traditions from Zoros also influenced the combat doctrines of the chapter. The Firehawks were proponents of overwhelming open assaults, shock tactics, and close combat engagements, seeing the use of camouflage, any defensive tactics, or even ranged warfare as inherently dishonorable. Prowess in close combat was everything, and a strong culture of honor dueling with either burning brands or burning swords was encouraged as a way of settling differences within the ranks. In fact, active participation in the dueling circles and the attainment of additional titles and personal glory was the only way Battle Brothers could rise through the chapter. Their battle line exhibited a heavy preference for assault squads and other jump troops, and though they retained stocks of Terminator armor, it was common for their first company to deploy entirely as Vanguard veteran squads. While their preference was for engaging their enemies in melee, the chapter also made heavy use of flamers and other weapons of extermination at close range. Their forges were geared towards this close assault focus. They retained the ability to build and maintain Mark III iron armor, its brutal construction perfect for the point-blank range the chapter's tactical and devastator squads favoured, and these were supported by heavy line-breaking combat vehicles, such as Land Raider Redeemers and Crusaders and Vindicator tanks. As a fleet-based chapter, they were well equipped in terms of starships. Their battle companies were split between their assault vessels, while their first company and headquarters assets were based on the colossal Raptorus Rex. A massive pre-imperial, warp-capable star fortress constructed during the dark age of technology, the Raptorus Rex was one of the largest warships ever seen in service of the Imperium, and served as the chapter's fortress monastery. The size of their fleet, of course, necessitated a far larger complement of chapter serfs and servitors than was usual for a Space Marine chapter, who were, of course, treated as completely disposable assets by their masters. These variations and traditions, of course, could make them difficult allies, and warriors of the Firehawks were often considered overly prideful and lacking in brotherhood by the chapters who served alongside them. Their notorious arrogance, the same that saw them quit battlefronts on a whim, was rooted in a belief in their own total superiority over all other Imperial forces, and a complete unwillingness to spend their lives for anything other than the highest of causes. And while that made the chapter wildly unpopular on campaign, it also made them useful tools for the High Lords. In M38, the chapter were designated one of the 5 Manus Irae and charged with the devastation of the heretical Malagant sector. Over 21 years, the Firehawks and their allies in the Silver Skulls, the Charnel Guard, and 2 other chapters lost to history, conducted a campaign of extermination across the sector where hundreds of billions were put to death as whole worlds were subjected to virus bombing or slaughtered in merciless pogroms by the warriors of the Astartes. The exact reasons for that brutal extermination are lost to history, but it's known that for their service in the war, they were granted a new homeworld, Cousteau 11, by the High Lords. However, within a millennia, their new homeworld had yet again been rendered uninhabitable, and the chapter took to the void again, taking a sacred oath to pacify the Golgothan wastes through a series of brutal castigations. From the early 40th into the late 41st millennia, the chapter would conduct 13 castigations of Golgotha, which varied in size, from the entire chapter fleet wiping out the encroaching Xenos Empire of the Zarth Omog Trinity in the 3rd castigation, to a single strike cruiser hunting down the renegade Space Marines of the damned company of Lord Kaustos in the 10th castigation. And it was a strike cruiser from the final castigation that would eventually light the match that would set the maelstrom aflame in what would become the Badab War. The Firehawks were the first chapter from outside the Maelstrom Zone to become involved in the Badab War, when they responded to the call for aid from the Imperial Governor of the Carthago sector, Tanit Koenig. The Carthago sector was at this point involved in a low-level conflict with neighbouring Badab sector over the delivery of the Badab tithe. Citing his responsibility to protect the Maelstrom Zone, the chapter master of the Astral Claws, Lufthuron, had withheld the tithes of his sector, directing them instead towards the construction of an ever greater army to finally pacify the dangerous and heretic-haunted Maelstrom Warpstorm. The Carthago sector relied on those tithes, and so an internecine war had developed in the shipping lanes between the two sectors as tithe materials were seized and re-seized. When the Carthans put out the call for Astartes' aid, it was a vanguard ship from the Firehawks, the Red Harbinger, conducting operations in the nearby Golgothan Wastes, who responded, initially forcing its way into the Endymion cluster where, after ignoring all warnings, it was attacked and detained by the Mantis warriors. The master of the Firehawks at that time was Knight Commander Stibor Lazarek, an ancient and competent battle leader, at that point nearly 600 years old and in failing health, and widely regarded by those who were forced to serve alongside him as a bitter, cantankerous and prideful individual who made a habit of feuding with other Space Marine commanders and Imperial lords. In particular, Lazarek had held a grudge against the Astral Claws for almost a century since the Lycanthos Drift campaign, when Lufthuron had been given overall command of the assembled Astartes forces instead of him. The seizing of one of his vessels by the Astral Claws allies was all the excuse he needed, and Lazarek immediately committed almost his entire chapter to the conflict. By the end of 904 M41, almost 90% of the Firehawks chapter was engaged in open warfare with the Astral Claws, supported only by the Carthan battle fleet, and eventually by a task force from the Marines errant. In this, Lazarek rarely took to the field, operations often being led by his heir apparent, the bellicose Knight Captain of the 8th Company, Elam Corbray. It's a testament to the strength of the Firehawks fleet that they managed to hold out against vastly superior numbers for almost another year, and their impetuous involvement, which had led to 5 Space Marine chapters being in open conflict, was a key reason the Inquisition finally stepped in late 905. When the Inquisition finally ruled against the secessionists and brought in significant Astartes forces to pacify the Maelstrom Zone, the Firehawks, at this point reduced to around 20% strength, were forced to withdraw from the war lest they risk the future of their chapter. Bitter at being ordered to remove themselves by the Inquisition, the spiteful Lazarek made one final assault, stationing the Firehawks fleet above the Mantis warriors' protectorate of Sacristan in the Endymion cluster and firebombing it from orbit. However, that wasn't the end of their involvement in the war. Near the end of the conflict, as the loyalist noose tightened on Badab itself, the Firehawks successfully petitioned for their re-entry, and the Raptorus Rex, the largest ship available to the conflict, was a linchpin of the later loyalist battle plan. In the aftermath of the Badab War, the chapter were once again granted a domain, this time the Endymion cluster, where the domains and chattels of the Mantis warriors were handed over to them as part of the settlement. However, characteristically, they didn't manage to hold on to it for very long. A few decades later, in 963 M41, while responding to an invasion on Crow's World, the entire chapter, consisting of the Raptorus Rex, 5 ships of the line, and almost 800 battle brothers, vanished in the warp. No sign of them remained. The Firehawks were eventually declared missing in action, and the chapter was stricken from the rolls by the Administratum, the bell of lost souls on Terra, tolling 1,000 times for their loss. However, their strange fate was to be revealed a couple of decades later. From 986 M41, a number of mysterious events occurred on the far galactic east. In the Jakor Tal sector and the sectors surrounding it, enemies of the Imperium were found dead, Orkheld systems found purged of Xenos, and strange spacecraft sighted as the attacks appeared to increase in their intensity and destructiveness. In 987, after a near miss with an unidentified spacecraft in the Sift system, 2 space coffins were recovered, which contained Adeptus Astartes corpses in an advanced state of decay, bearing arms and armour that matched the serial numbers of equipment issued to the Firehawks. And finally, on a remote Imperial research base, these strange allies were sighted. During an Orc raid, after 3 hours of fighting, and just when the situation looked hopeless for the garrison, strange black-armoured figures appeared at the rear of the Orc mob, slaughtering the raiders in a horrifically brutal battle before vanishing without a trace. They left behind a standard, the gnarled chapter flag of the Firehawks, and inscribed upon it was the motto, "For the Emperor beyond the point of death." And at the foot of the banner was a recording unit, which allowed the Adeptus Mechanicus to piece together what had happened to the lost Firehawks. After making the jump towards the Crow's World sector, the entire Firehawks fleet had been caught in a warp storm of terrific ferocity. Only the Raptorus Rex emerged, and when it did, it was far beyond the border of the galaxy. Only 200 Battle Brothers survived the storm, with all their gene seed reserves, initiates, and much of their high command lost, as well as all those worthless serfs, but who needs them anyway? Worse, the remaining Battle Brothers had been changed by some weird warp affliction. Doomed to agonizing deaths, many of the remaining Battle Brothers went mad as their skin began to blacken and blister, and to age at an advanced rate. Their destruction seemed inevitable, but it also made them stronger, almost impervious to injury or suffering. As the warp-borne malady took hold, the Battle Brothers would become resistant to psychic interference, supernaturally aware of their surroundings, and started to emanate an aura of terrifying fear around them. But despite these changes, they were still Space Marines, still servants of the God Emperor, and so they elected to fight until the warp malady eventually claimed them. They repainted their armour from flame red to black, though they kept the practice of painted flames and the symbols and markings of death. All symbols of rank were removed, for there were too few left to form a chapter command hierarchy. All Battle Brothers were made equal before death, and the warriors vowed to spend their lives searching out and destroying the enemies of the Emperor, led only by an increasing number of strange psychic visions and the Holy Emperor's Tarot. They'd become the Legion of the Damned, a ghostly force that fought in the name of the Emperor across the galaxy, emerging from and vanishing back into shadow, and always seeming to arrive exactly when they're needed. The Firehawks are, in modern 40k, the most compelling, but not the only origin story for the Legion of the Damned, but the way this came about was predictably winding and backwards. The Legion of the Damned predate the Badab War. This article from White Dwarf 99 in 1988 came out just 6 months after the launch of 40k and introduced the chapter and the story of how they became the Legion, and there had even been a couple of Marines in the Flame and Skull scheme featured in adverts for the Metal Imperial Space Marines range a bit before that, but neither of them go into any detail on the Firehawks themselves. The Firehawks are then mentioned in White Dwarf 101 2 months later, with the introduction of the Badab War, and this features their colour scheme, which, now we know what actually happens to them, bears a striking resemblance to their eventual decor. And at that time they used this nuclear blast as a symbol because, war crimes. As with all Badab chapters, the Firehawks are then forgotten for the entire of the 90s. They basically only pop up when the Legion of the Damned, who are way more popular, are mentioned, but always in a little aside, or when the Badab War is mentioned just as the guys who started it all. They finally received some actual backstory in 2010 with the Forge World Badab War books, where all the existing information is rolled into the new kind of only description of their culture. We knew they'd turn into holy ghosts, so they're one of the few chapters that worship the Emperor. They used to have this nuclear blast, so they're a war crime chapter, though the actual symbol is now replaced by a phoenix-like hawk rising from the flames, and they're given the recurring theme of getting completely destroyed, usually in fire, and then rebuilding again and again. The Firehawks of 2010, and of now, feel a lot more fleshed out, and consistent with what they'd become in the Legion of the Damned. Now, the story of the Legion of the Damned is a bit more complex. The idea that the Legion of the Damned are the Firehawks is still the only canon example of an origin story they have. However, as the universe has been fleshed out, loads of other theories have been floated for the Legion's origin. Are they the equivalent of demons but for the Emperor or something? So there are other theories in 40k as to the Legion's origin, but they are always presented as either the musings of some inquisitor in world who doesn't know all the facts, or are just made up by fans. Olden Demon has a fantastic conspiracy theory on his channel where he tries to figure out what their story was going to be back in the late 90s, link in the description, but modern 40k lore has changed so much that it can't be true anymore. The Legion of the Damned have certainly hung around in the lore way longer than that original wasting disease story would suggest, and there have been short stories and novels since then where they recruit new members or they haunt specific buildings. There's probably a whole video on the different appearances of the Legion of the Damned, but for now, I'm going to stick with this story since this is technically a video about the Firehawks, and it's also the only published story we have. So there, the Firehawks, the real instigators of the Badab War, and a chapter so horrible that turning into terrifying ghostly zombie marines actually seems to have made them more likeable. Thanks for watching. And if you'd like more videos about the lore of 40k, there's a little box popping up to the right there. And if you'd like to support the channel, there's the usual links to the Patreon or the YouTube membership scheme in the thing below. See ya!